Your death, it doesn't mean you any harm. It's the most faithful companion you'll ever have. The inability to die is one of the things that calls our humanity into deep disrepair. We're death-phobic in the extreme. Your dying is your life, and your refusal to know that is not life-affirming. It's life-betraying. The great consequence of refusing to die well is the corruption of the capacity that others can grow by virtue of attending to your dying. What will their understanding be of dying then? You'll have another generation with a grudge and a grievance against the natural order of things. In a culture that does not believe in endings, how do they solve heartbreak? Answer is less heart. And that's why the sedation, the antidepressants. Where is it written that the best dying is the one you don't notice? Why should dying not break your heart? When you become a practitioner of grief, it stays. Now, you don't get invited to many parties, I can tell you from personal experience, if you become a practitioner of grief. But your understanding of love is renovated for all time. My ability to be alive became habit forming. I looked around and I became almost involuntarily grateful. Death, it's an ending. But you can know that you will die, so you can chart your course accordingly. And that's how it begins.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs, sharing our vulnerability, overcoming our fears, transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
How are you going to die? That's what we're going to talk about this week on London Real. And I found this man, Stephen Jenkinson, who has spent his entire life pondering that question. How do we die? And he's concluded that we live in something called a death-phobic society. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to think about it. In fact, almost everything we do in our daily lives is to make us think the opposite about life and about youth, and to not have this real conversation that at some point we are going to stop existing. And Stephen spent most of his life in palliative care, and he was present for the deaths of some 1,500 people. And he studied what was going on, and he realized that we all need to have these conversations on how we're gonna die and be comfortable with our death every single day. And that allows us to actually live our life. He's got an incredible book called Die Wise, and he says that the way that you die is going to affect your loved ones and your family after you're gone. And if you can do it in a way that has nobility and has ethics and has truth, then it's going to leave a legacy for your children's and your friends and your loved ones on how they can live their lives and how they can also die in the same manner. It's an important conversation. I'm really glad we had it with Stephen. He's a very difficult man to understand. He reminds me a bit of Ido Portal when he talks about movement. And so you might not get it on the first pass, but I think these are conversations we need to have. And if you can get comfortable with your death, I believe you can start having a great life. So I'll leave you now with Stephen Jenkinson. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Stephen Jenkinson, the storyteller, teacher, and author. You hold a master's degree in theology from Harvard University and a master's in social work from the University of Toronto. During your 2 decades of work in palliative care, you counseled over 1,500 people on their deathbeds. Your work led you to identify a death-phobic society, which provided the framework for your award-winning book, Die Wise, a Manifesto for Sanity and Soul. Your most recent book, Come of Age, The Case for Elderhood in a Time of Trouble, explains why we must birth a new generation of elders willing to be true stewards of the planet and its species. Stephen, welcome to London Real.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. First of all, what do you think of this city? Do you have a relationship with it?
Like a water spider has with water. You know, not much descent, not much penetration, but a kind of scramble on the surface. Okay. That's all I've ever been able to manage, because I come to places like this sort of on tour. So you could say you've been to London, but it's not true. I've been to highways, venues, hotels, airports.
All right.
But this is, it took me a long time to get here this morning, and I saw the place a little bit, so it was a pleasure.
What do you think of it?
I'm glad I wasn't driving. I would never drive here.
Do you like big cities?
Well, I think the antipathy or the mistrust is mutual. The mistrust, that's better. Antipathy is too strong. Yeah, I have a healthy hesitation about the madness of too many people in one place. Yeah, and it's not just a style thing. You know, it's some critical mass that's gone on way too long, and it's an indefensible conglomerate. You know, and the consequences to the immediate environs are so discernible, and there's no sign of any general willingness really across the West to rein it in and to begin to really take seriously the consequences of growth for its own sake. So that's what I see cities to be, is profligate tumors, right? I know that's really strong language, and I know people enjoy living there, and good for them. And
you live off the grid,
way off the
in
grid.
Ontario,
Yeah.
with your own wells and solar panels, and that's the other existence for you.
Yeah, that's home, as much as I can inhabit it doing this kind of thing. I'm lucky to have it, but and I should say that I don't mean to make it sound as if have a morally superior way of life because I'm able to do it that way, because it has its own madnesses. Our agriculture is in many ways a disastrous enterprise as well, you know. So you have to really negotiate your relationship to the land. But the good news is, for me, that it's kind of unmediated. I don't have to do it through buildings and structures and how to get around. And I'm able to do it very directly, in real time, in an actual place, not a symbolic place. So this is an enormous privilege, which I have to, I think, earn routinely. And then we have 8 or 10 young people that are working the farm essentially now. And the principal apprenticeship that I obliged them to was only peripherally about the seeds, about the ground, the particular ground that we have. And so it was largely about this, about your lived relationship and renegotiating this notion of, quote, who's in charge, who's calling the shots, and understanding agriculture to be a public service that no one's asking you to do.
Stephen, I really wanted to have you here to talk about something that, funny enough, in 8 years and 500 guests, we've never actually had a candid talk about death. Oh. And I know it's something that you talk about, and I was asking myself, I wonder who's going to enjoy this show, and then I realized, well, they all have a vested interest in this topic, and they all know people that've gone through this or are going through it as they speak, or will, and yet, from everything I read about you, we're doing it all wrong, or we need to at least be conscious of how we're doing it, or at least we need to have this conversation. So I'd love to talk to you about that today. Okay. For some reason, I'm kind of compelled to tell you about some of my experiences with death. I was wondering if we could start there.
Your show.
Okay.
Sure.
I had 4 grandparents who are now passed. Again, people from kind of the Midwest, and as a young kid, I saw them be parts of my life, and we can talk more about that in your later book. They were real elders, kind of parts of the family and hubs of the family, and we were always taught that they were, kind of important, and we would kind of go to see them as pilgrimages for Christmases, and it wasn't just because they were older. It was like this kind of deep level of knowledge and respect, something, unfortunately, I don't think my kids will have with their grandparents. But when they passed, I was a bit younger and never really had much closure or experience with what's happening. I think I went to one of their funerals. A little bit later in my life, one of my good friends died of cancer at about 42 years old, and I was godfather to his daughter, and I got to see him kind of waste away, and it was a real hard thing for me to watch. And at the same time, I think it taught me a lot of lessons. One of them, I think, was leaving my job in banking and even starting this show. I think it just really hit me in the stomach that I was mortal and that there was something more going on here in my life. My other experience with death was my own overdose from heroin in New York City in 2001. That's probably the least experience I had with death because I don't really remember. I just remember having to kind of face myself that, wow, okay, you almost ended this. And at the time I didn't care, but I think it caused me to make some decisions later in life. And then my final one I had last year, I was down in the jungles of Costa Rica, and I had a pretty heavy ayahuasca ceremony, and there I felt like I really died about 20 different times, and it was definitely not pleasant. I remembered feeling it, how unpleasant it was, and how I was really trying to fight as a human. And at the same side, I saw this entity that was Gaia, and everything was just going to be dissolved anyways, and there was no need to be emotional about this life changing from one molecule being to this piece. And so it's kind of general, but these are just some of the thoughts I had around death and some of the things that went through my mind about a year ago. I don't know if that helps to start this discussion, but I was curious, how do you usually start talking about this concept with people?
Well, it's not really a crowd pleaser, and it's not a small talk thing. It doesn't submit to being clever or coy, especially ironic, all the high water marks of casual conversation in urban centers in particular. So I probably don't. The truth, I'm kind of paid to do it, and otherwise it's proper that I should probably stay at home. And then if somebody inquires after it, then I'm happy to be available. But as an advocate, no, I don't see myself that way at all. I don't push anything in that respect. I was introduced a couple of years ago as a visionary, which was intemperate and kind, but I'm not sure it was accurate. But I was not happy with it. So when I got up to respond, I thanked them, and I said, a word came to me, which seems more accurate to the enterprise that I've been burdened with. Divisionary, I said. I think that's maybe closer to what I do. So, dying is not a user-friendly proposition in a culture that doesn't believe in endings. That believe, like even the ayahuasca characterization you made, like there's no ending. And people love the word transition. It's kind of, it eases things, and apparently endings are illusions. Illusion is an illusion. Endings are real, And that's what marriage is. It's the end of everything, everyone else you could have been with. It's an ending. And that's how it begins. And human conception is the end of ovulation. It's an end. And I don't know why, well, that's not entirely true, but I just say as a figure of speech, it remains mysterious to me. The hostility towards endings is presented as a life-positive orientation, that it's life-affirming. But there's nothing about life that refusing to end affirms. Because when you observe, like speaking as a farming person now, so we have Earth, which we're deeply responsible to and for. And what is Earth? What's dirt? And the answer is everything that didn't make it this far. That's what it is. It's not a symbol. It's death in your hand. And once you see it, you know how it comes to be. You have to have death to end up with that stuff. And if you don't have that stuff, you will not have anything growing. So what is life rooted in? It's not rooted in life. That's just, there's no observation that sustains that prejudice. Life is rooted in death and requires death. So life is not life-giving. Life is life-taking. That's its gig, you see. Whereas death grants life another shot. It's enormously generous. But the refusal to die turns into a kind of exercise in opting out of this arrangement. And don't get me wrong, it's not easy to come around to crafting some willingness to die. It's a counterintuitive, utterly hope-free proposition. But that's the pitch, that if you're unwilling to die, then your manner of dying takes as you go. And what dying is really supposed to be is you sort of releasing your death grip on everything that granted you, your certainties, your stabilities, your sense of yourself and all of that. And you're basically cashing out. And hopefully with a sense of gratitude about the whole operation. That of course everything didn't work out. Most of it didn't work out. By most standard understandings of work out. But it was remarkably just in some strange way that you made it this far. A lot of people didn't. Nobody who's dying ever does the math on, a lot of people don't get to die at 70 or 80. They die at 7. That's where I was. I superintended death of a lot of children. And there's much easier ways to make a living, I'll tell you, than that. And the notion that kids, the worst aspect of them dying, especially to their parents, is not the fact that they're dying. This is going to sound awful, what I'm going to say to you, but I observed it over and over again, that most parents were devastated by the fact that by virtue of their child dying, the child would not get to live a full life. That was the principal grievance they brought to the court of last resort, And it was my sort of sorrowful responsibility to challenge that very deeply. What do you mean a 7-year-old hasn't had a full life? Because they haven't reached the age of majority that you imagine constitutes a full life? Ask anybody at the age of majority, have you had a full life? So the notion of full life, the way we cling to it, is informed by this prejudicial spell that we're in called potential. Right? That's what you're supposed to live up to. That's what you're supposed to reach and strive towards. And everybody, at least senior to you, when you're a teenager in particular, is very clear that you're not living up to your potential. You're the only one who's confused about it. But they're all very certain about it. And you say, well, where's this potential I'm supposed to live up to? Well, it's in the future. Well, when am I supposed to get there? And the answer, of course, is you never get to the future. If you get there, it's called the present. The future never happens. So the notion that you're supposed to live up to this carrot on the end of a stick called all you could be is tyranny. It's not encouragement. It's the end of encouragement. It's the kind of gutting of encouragement, yeah?
And that causes anxiety around our death, ultimately.
Yeah, I think the large story that I was witness to is that North Americans, which is the only place I can speak about with any familiarity, that North Americans are addicted to a terminal degree to their competence and their certainties and their swagger and their autonomy and mastery. These things are recipes for dying a miserable, grinding death, guaranteed, virtually. But the addiction is very strong. And the reward system starts when you're about this tall. To get the right answer as quickly as possible in school, for example. Not to tolerate the learning, which is like the halfway house towards knowing. Learning, in fact, is an adult proposition. And knowing it's like an entry-level thing. Certainty and all of that. Think of the word ambivalence. You were trained away from it as a kid, as was I. And it was identified as you being profoundly at sea, right? And not to be trusted if you engaged in ambivalence. Certainly not to be taken seriously or relied upon. But the actual word means what? Ambi. It means several contending somethings. And valence is a word we get from chemistry and physics. And it means the way by which a certain thing can be recognized as itself. It's kind of tracks, if you will. It's footprints. And you put the word back together, it doesn't mean confusion at all. The ability to be ambivalent means to nurse a number of contending possibilities, more or less at the same time, without the utterly arbitrary, often radically unnecessarily premature lapse into certainty by eliminating all of the possibilities, all of the contentions, but one, you know.
Didn't Einstein once say a measure of man's intelligence was how many conflicting ideas he could hold in his head?
If he did, he was onto something.
Right, at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? And so, is this a recent phenomenon? Like 100 years ago or 200 years ago, you know, especially in North America where you grew up, would that have been less an issue? Or was that always part of the Western vibe? Well,
you know, the Western mind hasn't always been. So depending on your time frame, and that there's not one Western mind. You know, we could, you know, for brevity's sake, you could use the phrase dominant culture. That's the phrase I tend to use, the dominant culture West, which is a very present proposition, and it's not just in Western countries. I mean, the Americans in particular have exported it all over the world. And the Chinese are better at being Western than most Westerners now are. So, but with that in mind, you know, this utter refusal to submit has a long and dire history amongst humans. But it's not pervasive across all cultures and all times. But it seems to me that any culture that was spawned more or less spontaneously with no real precursor by a kind of hellish flight away from medieval miseries and so on. This is North America in a nutshell. Australia too, at the very least. The Caribbean to a great extent as we know it today, and other places. And one of the consequences, people cross the ocean, allegedly for a better life. What they're doing is they're running. This is not the best building blocks to build a good building with, people on the run. But they were, and that's how I end up where I am. That my people's people were running. And as they came across, they were obliged more or less to leave behind everything that they were fleeing, yes, but what about the rest? What's the rest? Well, the cultural continuity that, among other things, told you what was to become of you in your dying time and thereafter. In a word, your ancestry. And North America is an ancestor-free zone. And it's a ghosted place because we've had generations of people look like me in North America now, dying without any cultural continuity or stories that give them a profound understanding of what's asked of them when they're dying. So what's the definition of a ghost? One would be someone who doesn't know they're dead, for whom the habits of life have not been extinguished by any fundamental ending. And they've been nursed along by the New Age notion of transition instead, as if nothing has to end. And I think that's a recipe for being stuck in the bardos, as they say in Buddhism, you know.
This is someone holding on to the last year of life.
Yeah, or certain people or certain places, whatever it might be. But the notion is that the habits of life should properly be the first casualty of you entering into the ending of your days. But if that's all you have, why would you forego them for the sake of a mystery, which is still a human-scaled thing? The ending of your days is not psychopomp. It's not cosmic. The ending of your days is a human-scaled mystery that's entrusted to you. And in that sense, it's a skillfulness that is seeking you out, not something that's being done to you, but a way by which humanity can appear again among us. And the way by which we die will either be like the last manifestation of your understanding of what it means to be human, or it'll be the undoing of every understanding you ever had about what it means to be human. And my job security, alas, was predicated on the fact that virtually everyone died in the second way. Kicking, screaming, wailing, sedated, slack-jawed, and drooling. That was the norm.
That was 1,500 people you...
Well, I don't know the numbers. You know, it's a generous number. Let's just say I saw probably more death than most people in active combat see in wartime. And, you know, if you go to the PTSD model of Veterans Affairs, it would be easy to imagine that everything you're hearing from me comes from being traumatized by exposure to too much death. Well, you can decide if I'm traumatized or not. But what I'm telling you is what I saw, not what I'm afraid of, not what I'm afraid might happen if we don't get it right. But I actually saw it. And I'm in that very lucky position simply of reporting on what I saw and of being troubled aloud because of it. That's my gig. That's why I said divisionary.
Mm.
Yeah.
These people didn't know how to die, but how would they know how to die? And is that something that goes back to culture, ancestry, deep down into purpose? I mean, there's a quote from you was saying that death is the crucible of making human beings. Every culture worth a damn knows that. It's not success, growth, happiness, it's death. Mm. Talk about divisionary. Mm. Can you explain that? Or did you just
That's
do
a pretty good
it?
explanation, though.
It is pretty good.
It stands pretty good on its own.
I mean, it does, but
Yeah.
the crucible of making human beings, so our relationship with our death is what makes us human.
That's a secondary characterization.
Okay.
Our relationship with death. That's a very human-centered rendering of the extraordinary
Me trying to get out of it.
See, of course.
Right.
I mean, all the language that you would probably go to is a way of getting away from it.
Right, okay.
See, our relationship with death is not the same as death. How I feel about dying is not what dying is. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
It's a very strange, one step removed thing that we've come up with. Let's take the word indigenous, okay? Very heavily used word in certain circles today. Inherently noble, right? Echo warrior and the whole thing. I don't need to replay it all.
Yeah.
But if you investigate the word, it means nothing of this kind. It means in locates. It's talking about where. It literally means inside. It's place specific. And the GEN root, from which we get genetic and to generate and genesis and so forth, means to be born or conceived or crafted in. That word signals an identity that's place-based, not human-centered. It's place-based. See? The human is not in the center of the operation. And dying is exactly the same function in your life if you grow some understanding of it. If you're willing to learn dying, you learn that it's a God. That's how I've come to understand it. Death is a deity, right? And as such, there's a kind of etiquette, if that doesn't sound too austere. There's a kind of devotional etiquette that is needed to approach this mysterium tremendum called your ending. First of all, it's not personal. This is apostasy today. The notion that I'm going to suggest to you that the more personalized things are, the less profound they are, as a rule. So death is not personal. So there's no such thing as your death. There is the death that's entrusted to you in the same way that your body was entrusted to you, right? Not really yours. More apostasy. So this deity is not your personal lapdog on a leash doing your bidding, backing away when you insist and coming close when you feel like it. You know, that's a domesticated little chihuahua. But death is a serious business. And your death is not that interested in your ideas about it. It doesn't inquire after them. Certainly is not solicitous where your feelings are concerned. And in a kind of controlled, junky cultural milieu, like the one I'm from, those things are all insults. Very good example is a story. I'm walking up 3 flights of stairs to see a 28-year-old woman who's dying of breast cancer with mets to her lungs. She has maybe, from what I could tell, maybe 2 months to live. I knock on the door. I know already something about her. I wonder if she knows it. She's never coming down those stairs. I know that. And it's a very mysterious encounter to see someone you've never met before and to know something about them that it's not clear that they know, you know? And there's no sense of superiority or mastery or anything that comes with it. It's forlorn that you meet someone and you wonder how deeply they're inhabiting the days that are left to them. So I'm let in, long story short. There's her mom who's flown in from Winnipeg to help out in a troubled time. I asked her what's happening. She said, well, I'm seriously ill, as if that's a synonym for dying, which it isn't, but that's what she said. But really, she said, I don't let it be a big part of my life. And she looked at her mother, and I do not exaggerate this. Her mother looked at her daughter and went. And then she looked at me and she said, that's my girl. You see the reward system? It's to not die while you're dying.
Fighting cancer, these types of things.
Not even fighting. Like that's a sucker's game in this view. And then if it can't get weirder, it can always get weirder. So what did she say after that, you ask? She looked at me and she said, and my yoga instructor says I'm on the right track. Oh, well, you got mom colluding on the one side and Mr. Yoga on the other side. So what chance does death have in this house when it's demonized as an interruption into your constitutional right to have a normal life?
And what would you rather have had her say? What do you think would have been a more healthy?
For her sake.
For her sake.
I should say, not rather to satisfy me in any way.
For her sake and for her family afterwards. Another important point you make.
And how about this culture, too, while we're at it? Yeah. So everybody but me could benefit from my suggestion about how to go otherwise. It could have been this. I don't let it be a big part of my life. No, it is your life. Your dying is your life. And it's most of your life. And your refusal to know that is not life affirming. It's life betraying. You see, because now you've come to life as like a beneficiary of an insurance policy. And it only works when it cashes out, you see. And as soon as it asks something from you, now it's a ripoff. But it was exactly the same deal as the one you benefited from. And I know she's dying young. I'm not being harsh about it. A little. But why? To make a plea that as a grown-up of 29 years of age, she had a fundamental responsibility to open the door when death said, you are so-and-so? Yeah. Well, I haven't lost track of you, and we're going to sit together now until one of us won't. That's how we'll be, and we'll have to figure out how to do it. And the onus of the learning is yours, because I already know this one. Yeah. So why is death not allowed to be a big part of your life? And why is yoga sane? And why is a mother who colludes entirely, why is that called love? Why is that called maternal responsibility? To cheerlead your daughter away from her, let's call it her existential and moral responsibility to inhabit the last act of the play. To not abandon the house and go out screaming out into the street when the ending of the play comes into view.
And what is the benefit if she inhabits this last act? Does she make peace with herself? Does she pass on to her family an exit that is beneficial to the culture?
Maybe here, but the context is an important thing. The context is not, we're basically neutral around dying, so then how will her enhanced example affect things? No, the context is that we're death crazy, right? We're death-phobic in the extreme. That's the context where what you're asking me has to appear. So anybody who's watching mistakes what she's saying for someone who's heroic. What do they do when it's their turn? But turn to the heroic examples. And everybody knows a story of somebody who prevailed against dying until the last couple of days. It's absolutely misrepresenting what happened. The person was dying the entire time. Well, you want her to wallow in it? Why is wallowing the only vision of what it means to engage your death actively? Why is that it? It's either that or it's called fight or flight. It's a basic human response. Of course it is. But in a sane culture, what the culture gives you is a repertoire for what? For dying. Not for not dying while you are. A crazy culture makes dying another one of your lifestyle options. Right? You can turn it into a personal style thing. And, he fought till the end. He was strong. What does strong mean? You wouldn't have known he was dying. That's not strong. That's schizophrenic. Right? That's functional schizophrenia. And if enough people collude with it, what's it called? The hero's journey. So what's the consequence of dying badly? Most of the consequences are cultural and widespread. And the now dead person who died badly doesn't have to live any of the consequences they set into motion by their refusal to die.
And what are some of those consequences?
Me sitting here, you asking me about this is one of the consequences.
Okay.
No doubt. If this was rolling out nicely, you'd have no interest in the subject at all. Like me, you're probably cued to this by a kind of combination of contentiousness, a sort of fretful penumbra around the thing. Well, some of the consequences are the mania for self-determination, the mistaking of personal freedom for living a consequence-free existence, the utter misapprehension of what the responsibilities of citizenship are, in a quote, still nominally free place and time. Just for starters, the great consequence of refusing to die well, or deeply, or wisely, is the corruption of the capacity that others can grow by virtue of attending to your dying. It corrupts their capacity to orchestrate themselves in a village-minded fashion. And they become there as sort of bit players in your personal drama instead. And the kind of whisper campaign that emanates from your ultimately futile, heroic journey is that when it's those people's turn to die, they might have plan B. That would be a good idea. And what's plan B? In my country, it's euthanasia, which is now legalized virtually across the country.
And you're not a fan of euthanasia because it thumbs the nose at the deity again. It's
Well,
your terms.
It's sacrilegious. Now, how I feel about euthanasia is irrelevant. Whether I approve it or not is irrelevant. But I can wonder about it. I can have some discernment about it that's free of any feelings, relatively speaking, free. And here's what I come up with really quickly. Euthanasia is a death-phobic culture's solution to dying. Euthanasia is being decriminalized by cultures that remain death-phobic subsequent to the decriminalization. That's the great mystery. If a death-phobic culture legitimizes euthanasia, it's because the euthanasia is consistent with the death phobia. It doesn't challenge it. It doesn't re-educate about it. It's maintained by the euthanasia.
Right.
And what does that look like on the ground? You don't have to die. You don't have to put up with it. You don't have to learn how to do it. You don't have to be its servant, or you don't have any obligation to come to an understanding that's deeply unwelcome. You have none of these things. And when you decide, and you have the agreement of a couple of physicians who sign off on the fact that you're not nuts, Yeah, you're not just depressed, but you're dying in a death-phobic place. If you're not depressed, it's questionable whether you're even engaged in the thing. No, the degree of extraordinary levels of free-floating anxiety bordering on kind of chronic, disabling despair was the order of the day where I worked. If there was a similarly widespread cultural malaise, and it was identified as such, people would be on the streets about it, demanding action at every level, governmental and beyond. Why isn't there any such thing? There's no mobilization.
Why?
Against this dilemma. Because partly it's the emperor new clothes thing. It's not visible anymore because the death phobia has compromised all the attempts to subvert it. It's very powerful business. I'm making it sound like a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy because it's not orchestrated in a particular zone that's free of the conspiracy. There's no manipulation in that sense going on. You know, what's happening today is that there's a kind of parallel universe, self-appointed, credential-free practice zone called alternative death care. It's grown a direct reaction to the medically based, hospital-based, doctor-dominated thing. I'm not saying it's not an understandable thing. I'm saying they're hankering after mainstream status. And they are. And here's the thing. Everything that goes mainstream, what's it called? Normal. That's what happens to it. And the amazing power of normalcy in a democracy is its capacity to absorb everything that challenges it and turn it into part of itself and absolutely declaw and defang what could undo it. And that's what euthanasia will quickly be, to the point where if you have grandchildren, let's say, the likelihood of them growing their entire lives in a place where it's absolutely legal to refuse to die and to be killed instead will be the norm. What will their understanding be of dying then, when it's informed by dying as another opportunity for you to exercise your right to a suffering-free or suffering-controlled existence? My answer is, you'll have another generation of people extraordinarily self-absorbed, with a grudge and a grievance against the natural order of things, as soon as it includes them, not as its principal beneficiary anymore, but as its debtor. That's what's coming.
It's pretty dark.
Yes, sir.
You have a great expression which says, what has to die is your refusal to die. And so you want people to be with the death, to be there with it for all of its uncomfortableness and its deity, and not schedule it in a euthanasia. No,
because the center of the observation you're making is still the person's feelings about the thing. Okay. If you're marrying somebody, okay, it's understandable that you'd be preoccupied with how you feel about the person. But somewhere over there's the person who's not a sum total of how you feel about them. They were there before you had any feelings about them at all. And with any luck, there'll be a big portion of them that's not highly responsive to your feelings about them. That's trustworthy. That's dying. Dying is not the sum total of how you feel about it or the adjustment you make to accommodate it. I don't know how to say it more intensely than deity. And a deity, when it comes present among us, is a deep disrepairer, you could say. It undoes anything that's not informed by it. Let's use an example of people's belief system. I get asked all the time in interviews. So did you have, people who had strong beliefs died on your watch? Yes, they did. And they must, by virtue of having these beliefs, must have died better than the generic, non-aligned people. I said, why would you say that? Well, because their beliefs must have enabled them to blah, 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 blah. Well, you're counting on something. You're counting on their religious orientation to life or their spiritual orientation to life was crafted in the presence of this deity called death. That's what you're counting on there. So you know what I'm going to tell you. Virtually everybody's belief system that I worked with was designed and undertaken to protect and defend them against the presence of the deity. Not to learn its ways and live alongside it in the time that was left, but to have a firewall to prevent it until collapse was inevitable. And hopefully if the collapse lasts longer than 24 hours, you have a good outcome.
Any exceptions to that? Was there anyone that...
Sure, but they didn't need me, you see.
Right.
So what was my job? To make myself obsolete. Of course. To democratize death wisdom. That was my job. to work myself out of a job. That was my responsibility. But unfortunately, I sort of came of practice age in a time of increasing specialization. Well, this is no surprise, actually, because increased specialization is a ghetto. And if you can ghettoize end-of-life care and the alleged practice wisdom to guide its many technologies and so on, you've got job security for the people working inside the ghetto.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.